of why we want to have conversations, because so often there are stereotypes or misinformation that gets out, and we all know that legislation is long and complicated. So yeah, continue to just feel free to jump right in.
I think there is a sense of hypocrisy though, where those who are very quick to fight the crusade against pornography in the libraries were very silent when Senator Cook's bill that would, when a youth, a juvenile, buys a new cell phone, the internet lock would just automatically prevent pornography. Just for you know, to prevent that, just for that group, it would just automatically, so that if the parents said, hey, I want you to be able to access all that stuff, they could turn it back on. And it doesn't affect adults. That bill didn't get signed this year. It didn't make it through because there were legislators who had strong opinions about it. But if you're going to fight the fight against pornography in libraries but be silent on our cell devices, it's interesting to pick and choose. And maybe that's because the lobby and the money that was able to get into Boise to fight that bill was a little bit louder than other ones. But
that's a great point. And
it really is.
He didn't come up with that idea on his own.
Right.
That's something that already exists in neighboring states. I know specifically Utah, I think it passed last year or the year before, within the last 1 or 2 years. You can change the setting, you know, it's just a default setting when you get your iPhone. But yeah, interesting point on that, why that wouldn't be more supported when there is the crusade against pornography and so forth, but yet people wouldn't support that bill from Senator Cook.
I would argue that the digital should be more protected than the books, because I haven't been to the library in I don't know how long.
Right.
And my kids have gone to the library with the YMCA and then their school, but I have parental locks on their tablet that stop all those things. So not having more safety that way, where they have way more information and way more access to information, is kind of weird, and it seems a bit out of touch to what's going on now, and instead of what was the norm 30, even 15, 20 years ago.
There may be some hypocrisy, but I also think there is some difference in that the libraries are taxpayer funded, but public schools are essentially mandatory, hard to avoid it, so to speak. And the relationship between your iPhone and your carrier and that's a private commercial transaction.
Wouldn't the Wi-Fi be because it
Depends on where you're at.
depends on the what? Oh, okay.
So again, I get there may be some other differences, maybe not just pure hypocrisy, but maybe other principles at play where somebody is more willing to, as a legislator, take control over a state-funded entity and give empower parents on that versus take control over private transactions and so forth.
Yeah. For that bill, was it? Can you explain the other bill?
yeah, so Senator Cook's bill basically would just require that when a phone is activated for somebody under the age of 18 in the state of Idaho, those locks would just be a default. So parents wouldn't have to go in and put that lock on it. But I mean, there is another argument against this bill was that should the state be making these kind of mandates? And I think what the governor had asked for last time was, put together a more clear process of what this would look like. And so this is an argument of local control versus, every Republican candidate here in the primary will run on the fact that they support local control. But they were pretty quick to do a statewide regulation on all these libraries rather than saying, well, should the libraries themselves determine? I will say, credit to the governor for saying when he signed this bill, and we know he got thousands of phone calls telling him whether or not he should veto it or sign it. He did say, I want to send a very clear message to the legislature that if they make changes to bills, even if it's not the perfect bill, this isn't the bill Governor Little would have written, but he acknowledged and rewarded compromise to some extent. And I think that a lot of those legislators could follow his example in that.
So true. And one of the reasons he didn't sign it last time around is he felt that it was going to put undue stress and burden on libraries. So he said, go back to the drawing board. Let's kind of rethink that. And so, yeah, this is kind of that compromise, that middle ground, if you will.
Yeah, I didn't like the bill last year for that reason. I like the concept of trying to protect children from viewing this material, but there, kind of to Mark's point, yeah, he said in the beginning, there was too much openness in the bill that could allow for sabotage. Someone could plan a book, walk in, say, here's a book, and the librarians automatically find from that day, and it would hurt, especially rural libraries, who don't have the money to pay those fines. Now with the 60-day notice, I think this is a much better bill to compromise that you talk about. I think there was good compromise to make it a good bill, but also protect librarians and that.
That kind of puts a little pressure on those librarians, and I love that you brought up, both of you, that idea of sabotage, because we really are living in that cancel culture era where people love playing the blame and shame game and all of that. And so, I mean, it's not out of the realm of possibility that somebody might have some particular grudge and plant something. So I'm glad that they looked at this and did a different version that hopefully.
I'm in charge of my child's education. They're my responsibility. They're not the state's. They're not the libraries. They're not a librarian who thinks they know better than I know about what my child should read and not read. And I should have some kind of recourse. I think maybe this isn't the best vehicle that could be ever imagined, but like you said, unfortunately we live in a litigious. So what other recourses do you have? So they open this up and say, as a parent, you do have, if the library, the people that run the library, the librarians, the city council, the state, whatever, are not acquiescing to my request to have it removed, I have a recourse to address this in the courts.
And I do think there's still local control, because I agree with you, Brett, and I laugh, because you have the states that complain about the federal government getting too involved in their state. You have the counties and cities complaining that the state's too involved in their business, but the state legislature feels like it's their responsibility. And then, school districts, the county and not so much the county, but, sometimes the cities and especially the legislature want to dive into our business and mandates. And so I laugh on the one hand that we take so much pride in local control as a state, but then as long as it applies to the people above me, but not me and the people below me type concept. But with this library bill, there is still local control, because I agree with what Wayne said. There are people who have gone and complained to their libraries, and they're not making any progress. No one's listening to them, so they went to the next step. They followed the chain of command and said, they're not listening to me, will you listen to me? But yet there's still local control, because that bill doesn't have a list of books on it that says all these books need to be placed in a proper thing. It's still the local library council. Most libraries have a board or have a committee that if there's a book that's brought to their attention, they gather together, they read the book, they decide as that council if it's inappropriate or not, and if it is, it goes on the higher shelf. And so that local control for this particular bill, I think, is still there. There's plenty of that. There's not, though. But
And I think you're right. A lot of people thought what that means is that book gets kicked out of the library. It doesn't. It just gets moved, the placement, so that there's less of a chance that it's going to stumble into the wrong hands.
To an age appropriate.
Where's the accountability for the person bringing the issue forward? That's where I have a little bit of problem with this, because different people have different ideas of what's inappropriate. So somebody comes in with a very conservative attitude, and all of a sudden things that are not deemed inappropriate by the next level of thinking are all put into a separate location. So do we have a conservative library? Do we have a moderate library? Do we have a liberal library?
Well, I think that's where people need to get involved.
Yeah.
Because you're right, and that's what I like about the local controls, because depending on your city and the values of your city, what goes on the top shelf in City A may be available to everybody in City
Well,
B,
I
but it goes.
don't think the conversation should be about conservative, liberal, or moderate. It's about age appropriate.
Yeah.
Okay?
But
I think we have a conversation around that. Is it age appropriate to read to a 5-year-old about fornication or, oral sex or things like that? I would argue that's not age appropriate. It's not about being conservative or liberal or moderate. This is where the concern is that there are things that are being put in children's libraries that are not of age appropriate for that child.
Well,
I think what you're saying, because my 2 kids, I had them read a book about good touches, bad touches, and stuff like that, and then and it was about basically consent, and then that I later found out that book is actually banned in a lot of different places. And when really I read through it, it's literally just saying I don't want this person to touch me. This is what I say. But it did it with little cartoon characters, and it made it really fun.
And you had a conversation with your children about it. Am I correct?
Yes, I did. But I don't see a reason why every kid shouldn't have that book, because being somebody who was sexually assaulted by a woman when I was little, I would have loved having that book and having that knowledge when I was little. So that's kind of where it goes. Is it in this book that has cartoons? It doesn't talk about the things that adults do. It just talks about the touches and stuff with the context of this person may be trying to.
We all know that our experience is that when we read something as a child and we don't have an adult or a parent, in this case, help us understand and interpret, okay, it can lead to other things, thinking that this is permissive, this is acceptable. Whereas with a parent, you may go like, no, this is not acceptable. This is this is not acceptable.
Do you know what I like about what you said though, Mossy, is because Mosey, sorry.
No problem.
Is that you were there with your children. For me personally as a parent, from the way that you described that book, I wouldn't have a problem with my children having that book with me there with them going through that, so I can explain it to them.
Well,
I would have a problem if my child walked into a library on their own and read that book without myself being there to help explain what they're reading about.
This specific book didn't reference genitalia at all. This specific book referenced all types of touches. So it didn't make it. It didn't sexualize it really at all. It literally was just consent. So as little as, hey, can I touch your shoulder?
You may.
Like just as simple as that. And it conceptual. So it was age appropriate in the way of it explained these things, but because this specific book was protecting a kid from adults as well.
It's interesting. It's interesting you did that, because in my career, I've worked for the Boy Scouts of America as a district executive. I worked for Federal Express for 15 years. I worked for America Online for 5.5 years. I worked for Verizon Wireless. All these major companies have sexual training. What's appropriate behavior in the workplace?
When did the Boy Scouts start that? After the hundreds of $1 million in lawsuits and all this stuff?
I don't think that's fair.
I was a Boy Scout.
You're making a joke of something that's unfortunately.
I was heavily involved in Boy Scout, but as I've looked at the number of cases they have, the Boy Scouts has to be a case example of how it was handled incorrectly for decades.
By people that didn't follow the rules. Okay,
Yeah.
I was a scoutmaster and a district executive. Okay, the rule is that you never take a boy out unless there's two adults.
Too deep leadership.
That's
right?
correct. Okay.
When did that?
And unfortunately, there are people. It's a volunteer organization who, So for all the good the Boy Scouts did, I don't want to throw them under the bus because there were people out there that abused that.
So I actually,
but I understand.
I donated. I
agree with
But the point I was making was that in the workplace today, okay, if I did this and I didn't have his permission, I'm not going to put my hand, okay, it could be construed as inappropriate behavior.
Mm-hmm.
He could report this to my boss, okay, and we all know why we have these guidelines in the workplace. You talk to people in an appropriate way, you behave in an appropriate way, okay. Appropriateness is important.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, as a role of a parent, you're explaining to your children what's appropriate and what's not appropriate.
So
I
agree. I actually
point,
agree with you.
reading something that could make them think, well, this is appropriate, without, I think, an adult to help them understand the implications and guidance. I think that's part of the issue.
I actually just basically completely agree with you. There are those things, and I was a Boy Scout. I had a 2D leader, who brought me and started talking inappropriately. The reason why I didn't call it out when I was little is because I did not know, but I did know some other things, and so the issue is we have the legislation, we have people, they have the rules in those contexts. No, people don't always follow that rule, and my job as a parent and as an educator when I'm either working in the community or working with the YMCA or even working with musicians when I'm talking to them about who can take advantage of them. The thing that I need to be doing is preparing them. So if I don't prepare them to in the age appropriate way, then that's a big issue. So if there is a parent or an educator who says, I don't want you to read this book because I'm going to do something against you that you don't understand yet. And if you use this book, it might give you just a hint of context to have you tell on me. And so I think that having that information is the most important thing in the world. So when my kids or another kid reads this book and somebody comes up and touches them and they have the confidence to say, I don't like that. They can act on that information instead of going, this is okay, I trust you completely, and because that is what I did as a Boy Scout.
My observation on all this is the importance of having these decisions made at the very, very local level with the parents and the local library board involved, because this conversation can only take place in a setting like that. It can't take place at the legislature, it can't, and it's not going to be the same in every library district. And I think, but at the same time, I don't discount your concern about ideology creeping in, and that's why, I remember back when the pendulum had kind of was swung the other way on this, and they wanted to get Mark Twain books out of public school libraries because of some of the racial slang that was in it. And so this could swing, and it has.
Yeah.
As we've had classics attacked by certain ideology, we now have other books that are being, things that are being questioned by an ideology. It's almost inescapable. So I think we can't put our head in the sand and say, we set this policy without those considerations, because I think there have to be safeguards and an awareness that, again, it could be used as, oftentimes people want to use government as a club to beat somebody else over the head and make them conform. And that can again, with these issues, it can go so much both ways. It can be, parents being bullied, parents bullying the library staff, and you just...
Yeah, and the reason it's important to me, because when I was a realtor, I had somebody complain that I had discriminated, fair housing kind of complaint. And I had to go through a lengthy process and a lot of interviews and show them all of my paperwork. I was guilty until I could prove myself innocent. So that's my concern.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's scary in situations like that. It is.
Lots of things that we have to kind of decide beforehand. Otherwise, there's unintended consequences that can be detrimental. Well, buckle up, because we're going to tackle a really big issue, one that has certainly got a lot of different facets to it. Governor Brad Little has signed House Bill 538, and this is a bill that forbids educators and college professors from knowingly addressing transgender students by names and pronouns that differ from what's on their birth certificate. It also provides some protection, legal protection, for any teacher or educator who might morally just decide to misgender someone. So this is one of those, as I look at this, a lot of different people are going to interpret this differently.
Is it Solomon's baby? They cut it in half and they said, okay, I'm going to protect these people and all that. I mean, I don't quite understand that. So, so they're saying on the one hand you can't do it, but then they're providing protection for people that knowingly do it.
Right. It's very interesting the way that it is worded here. So I'm looking at it, it's saying, yes. So basically, the way I'm looking at it, it's telling educators you can't call someone something different than what's on their birth certificate. But then it comes back around and says, if you do,
If you do it unknowingly, then you're not held liable.
Yeah.
For instance, if a student a male student is dressing as a female, and you approach them as a she, you don't know that they're a he, so you didn't intentionally do it.
Right. So
it
there's
doesn't have to
protection.
but if they knowingly do it, they're protected from
Well, here it says, it forbids them from knowingly and intentionally addressing transgender students by names and pronouns that differ from what's on the birth
I got that
certificate.
part, but what's the
And
other?
then this other part says, the bill also provides legal protection for educators who deliberately misgender trans students. So it's really interesting the way that this is worded. So it's saying you can't knowingly misgender someone. You can't call them what they have chosen to be called. But then it comes back around and says there are protections for educators who deliberately misgender.
I'm not super familiar with that bill, but my understanding of that was if John wants to be called Sally and the teacher knows that, but knowingly continues to call them John, Sally cannot file complaints against the teacher for continuing to call that person John. That's my understanding of what that is saying. I don't know if it's right or wrong.
That's what it sounded like to me as well.
But
Right,
that's
so
what I
it's
understand.
protecting
It's
a
protecting
teacher.
the teacher who says,
Oh, okay.
you were born as John, your birth certificate says John, I know you want to be called Sally, but I'm going to continue to call you John because that's what's on my roll. And that teacher is protected from I don't know what kind of lawsuit, there's a lawsuit for everything today, but a harassment lawsuit for continuing to call them John.
For me, that just sounds like conformism, just like saying, I don't care, and it's like, well, they're kids, like, and we had a discussion before about, what was the other name, the Wilhelmina? About Wilhelmina, if Wilhelmina, a female, wants to be called Will or Willie, and whether William wants to be called Will or Bill, like or Will, Bill, Willie. It's like it doesn't seem like it's appropriate to say you want to go by this nickname. Well, you can't, and I won't call you that when it's just as easy to have on your roll sheet.
One thing that I listened to your conversation earlier. One thing that I would disagree with that concept is there are some names that are well known through history. Robert and Bob.
Mhm.
It's the same name. Some people prefer Robert, some people prefer Bob, but I think most people understand that it's the same name. In your example of William versus
Wilhelmina, I just.
Yeah.
Wilhelmina is not a commonly well-known derivative of William. It's, and so in that point, I would disagree with you a little, because I do feel bad for these teachers today. They're coming in, they have their role, and then they have what these kids are telling them, and how do you keep track of all of it? And I keep calling you John, and now you're upset with me, and I'm glad that I have this protection that if I keep calling you John, you can't take me action.
I think the protection of because it said intentionally,
Yes.
which that I think that's the intention, and we talked about that a little bit earlier. Is that the intention matters? So let's say that you called me Mossy, and I was like, no, it's Mosey, man, and then you're like, listen, I read it as Mozzie, and that's what I would call you, because that's what's on your birth certificate. Then I'd be like, actually. and it's not on my birth certificate. Then that becomes an argument in a classroom that does not need to happen. And as somebody who was diagnosed with ODD when I was little, that's going to cause a fight. And me and that teacher are going to go back and forth until the end of time for no reason.
Probably the bigger issue is the he and she is the pronouns. And I made this comment before this broadcast started. Okay, for a society and a world that is so enamored with science, and so often people say, prove it to me with the science. I will do it if it's the science. The science is genetically you're born a male or a female. It doesn't change if you have transgender surgery or you decide that you want to be a female or a male. It never changes. The genetics is there and always will be. Okay? And so that, I think, is what the public policy is being written to address, is that when you come into a public institution, you were born a male. Sure, you want to be dressed differently or be called differently, but you're not here. That's not where it's going to be. You're going to be called whatever you were genetically born to be.
When it comes to science, though, so linguistics is a form of science, and language changes.
We're not
and,
talking about that.
but irregardless.
No, we're talking about DNA, we're talking about, no, it's different.
But I'm saying,
You're comparing apples to
no,
apples.
what I'm saying is that, is there something wrong with pronouns changing over time so for us to have a different understanding?
Yes.
Because irregardless is in the dictionary now, and it wasn't before.
Well, it shouldn't be in the dictionary that way.
Yeah, so for me that's a little bit ridiculous because so when it comes to food, is it culture appropriation to take something from a different place and put it in my food, even though it
If it's
didn't
an
from my
orange, it's
culture?
an orange, it's not an apple. You can call it an apple all day.
But we have
You can
genetics
wanna
that we
be a
can
bird,
splice.
but you're not a bird.
We can splice together genetics to make a banana the way that we have now, and that came from different things coming together and then changing to
You're
what we
not
have.
talking about apples and apples, you're off,
I'm talking
you're
about
off
bananas.
point, you're off topic.
But
We're talking about the genetically what it is, you're born a male or female.
But
Do you agree or disagree with that?
I agree with that, but linguistically, pronouns are linguistic. And
Language
so-
is important.
Yeah,
It's
and,
what you call it is important.
and language is what we all agree on, so we can understand each other better.
Unfortunately, we live in a world where that's not true anymore.
Well, that's mainly because
Where
we
up is
don't want to
down,
change.
down is up.
Well, I mean, Saul Alinsky said you control the language, you control the debate, you know, so, and I think that over time, certainly, language morphs, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about giving somebody the right to say, if my teacher doesn't call me by the pronoun that I want, then my rights are violated, and I have a cause of action that they deserve to be punished. The law comes down against them. So it's not whether over time language will evolve. It does. That's a fact of life. It's whether a teacher is in a position of having, being in legal jeopardy because John wants to be called she, so I think we need to avoid that. I mean, the language may evolve as it may evolve, but that's not what we're talking about.
So I agree, but then the way that I look at that is how language has evolved over time. So my dad is, I can't remember how old he is now, but he was at a Martin Luther King rally, and I don't want to make everything about race because I'm the only black person here, and that happens sometimes. I don't want to do that. But my dad's birth certificate says Negro on it. Mine does not. And so at the time that made sense to call them that because that's what people said. Now, if you call me that, we have a problem. But that didn't happen instantly. That happened over time. And so that's why I bring up linguistics, because those pronouns can change over time because linguistics change. What we call people change. I am no longer an N-word. I am no longer 3/5 of a person. I am now a whole person legally. But at that time, I was not a whole person. So
At
now,
the time you were alive, or like
at
your
the time,
ancestors,
my ancestors,
great grandfather.
yeah, back during the 3/5 compromise, I was not a person. So in the future, are we going to be behind? Yeah. Please. So y'all got no right to call me the N-word, is my point. But then in 10, 15, 20 years, as linguistics change and in our minds,
It's going to become a non-issue at some point.
yeah, it'll become a non-issue where somebody's birth certificate could say dragon,
And some
but
of
that's
us, some
normal.
of us are saying that it should not change. It shouldn't be at the whim of societal move because they want to move out this way. No, you're either a male or female.
That's not what we're talking about. We're
Well,
talking.
I think we are.
No, we're not. We're talking about in a public institution whether or not a teacher is in legal jeopardy for what they choose to call persons. A completely different argument
No, it's
than
not.
whether or not you have the right to call yourself whatever you want. It's guaranteed by the Constitution.
But
You
not in
have
a public
But
place.
you can't demand that somebody else call you.
exactly. We're talking about. It's a completely different argument. I think when we talk about kids who are dealing with issues of their own identity, we need to lead forth with compassion and empathy,
Yeah.
and not say, do this finger wagging thing, but you're completely right. We also need to take care of our teachers. The teacher shortages in the state are not going to get better if we're putting them in legal jeopardy.
That's right, exactly.
And for my part, I think language is devolving, and eventually the birth certificates in the future will be filled out by emojis.
Yeah.
Which is, that's a
I hope so. That sounds good.
I think some great points. I love everything that's been shared, and I get that people feel very strongly that this is what it is by science. But I think the other side of the coin kind of goes to what you guys were saying, Brennan. How do we treat these kids who are struggling? How do we bring compassion into the equation? And I say this often because I believe it. You cannot legislate a change of heart. Real meaningful change is born deep within the heart.
Well, I think it's interesting that in Europe, where this was pioneered, in Great Britain and other places in Europe, the science, the scientists, the doctors, the whole society is moving away from this, that this is acceptable, that we should be performing transgender surgeries on children, and that we should be promoting this. It only adds to their confusion, and it's a wrong direction to go. So while they're moving conservatively back the other direction, we're moving that way, which I find really fascinating. Like, we're totally disregarding what their experience has been over the last 20, 30, 50 years, where they're saying, like, this has created a society of children and young people that are confused. And they get to be adults, and they hate the fact that they were either bullied, or they made a decision on their own, or somebody told them they should do this, and now they're wishing they never had, and they don't think that's the direction to go as a society, and they're moving back the other way, but we're moving that way. Which I find really interesting.
Confusion comes from a lack of information, which is what we talked about before, which is why I think it should be way more openly talked
It's not
about.
only information, it's about identity, knowing who you are.
Yeah, but it's hard to know who you are when you're a little kid and you don't have all the information, and you see this, and then one person says that's bad, and you see, and then somebody else says that's good, and it gets confusing. But to have unbiased information, I think is the best way to do it, because I'm doing it again. I'm mixed, and I'm mixed, and sometimes it got really confusing growing up, because my adopted parents are both, I was adopted, both black parents, but I am mixed. And then I had the weird situation where I had friends who were not the kindest in the world tell me, no, you can't be anything but black because I see you as black. And then I was like, but I want to learn about my Native American culture. I want to learn about my white culture. And they're like, but that's not you though. And I'm like, but it kind of is though. And so science would back me up to say, I am mixed. I'm all these things. But because people wanted to keep things the same way, and my mom was a history major, and she drilled it in my head. She said, one drop makes you black around here. And so that's a big issue for me when it comes to identity, because I needed all the information to become the person I am. Thankfully, my parents they're the most conservative Democrats you could ever meet. And so they gave me every single type of information and just said, this is the information. These are what objectively are dangerous. Stay away from these. But this is what they are. And so I had an understanding to come to the conclusion that whether I'm mixed or not, we're all the same, and whether I need to want to be called by this name, or this pronoun or that pronoun, doesn't matter. Just these are the things that you need to know in order to prepare you to be
But that does bring up the topic about compassion. What is compassion?
Yeah.
Is compassion allowing them to go down this road? Or is it compassion saying, like, you're confused, you really need to consider if this is the right decision for you to make at this point in your life or not?
You know, Wayne, I would say this, and I'd love to throw it out. I think sometimes young people really go towards the extreme of surgery because they're not being accepted in the moment. And if we accept them, and if we treat them with love and kindness, and here's the thing that I think we forget sometimes, we don't have to agree with somebody to treat them with kindness and respect. And so if we're able to say, okay, Sally, you want to be Johnny? We may not agree with that scientifically, but we care about you, and you matter more than ideology, so we're going to respect you, and we're going to create a safe space where you can come to school, and you can learn and you can grow, because a lot of the information that we see is that young people evolve as their brains fully develop. But when we put these obstacles in front of them, and when we set them up for bullying, because let's just look at it from this standpoint. Let's kind of go outside of the comfort zone. Okay, maybe it is biologically you're a male, and so we are going to call you a male. Well, this person is dressing like a female. So now they become the laughingstock of every single person at that school because they're trying to present how they feel comfortable. And now all of a sudden, when a grown adult is in essence bullying them, that signals, whether you recognize it or not, an invitation for everybody else to do it. So maybe we use this as a way to say, this is about humanity. This is about compassion, and this is about the golden rule of treating people the way that we would want to be treated ourselves.
You're characterizing it as bullying. I don't see it as bullying.
But
I
if you
see it
make
as
someone
correct
feel
identification.
uncomfortable, if you make someone feel uncomfortable, isn't that the
Comfort
essence
is
of
not the
bullying?
same as
It
true.
happens, Wayne. I see what you're saying, but.
Our feelings have become the truth in our society.
But there's a
If you
lot
feel
of
a way that makes it true, not necessarily.
I'm saying it doesn't make it true.
Well, what you're
You don't have to
referencing-
believe it's true, but you can still treat somebody with respect.
It still feels like to me conformity to say you need to do what I said and be what I said, and at that point just dye your hair blonde and say sick hell. Like I don't want to be that. That's not who I am. Like that is just not. I don't consider myself, even though legally on my birth certificate and I write my name David on my birth certificate on my legal documents. I don't consider myself David anymore. I consider myself Moses. And so you can respect that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we can be cool with that. And so I also identify as some other things. My pronouns are the same, but I identify as some other things when it comes to my relationships. And so when it comes to those things, why can't that be respected? Why can't that be respected in the same way as me going by a different
Well, I
name?
guess one of the arguments is because you're an adult.
Yeah,
They're not adults.
but we can't form them to the adults that we want them to be.
Sure, why not?
Because that's ridiculous.
Why is it ridiculous?
Because then we're all going to be you, and I don't want to be you.
You know, I'm not asking you to be me. I'm asking you to be
I
me.
like it, but I like what Pauline said because just some deep thought on some comments that she made, because maybe there wouldn't be this push for all of these other treatments, hormone or surgery or anything else, if we just accepted people for who they are, and we just treated people with kindness. And that's not just transgender. Just think of all the issues in the world that would go away if we could just treat people with kindness. If you're different today, and whether that difference is defined as transgender or a number of other things, you are bullied in the schools.
Yeah.
And it's sad, because I do think. Let me back up and say, I'll do a comparison. I've had several friends who have lost children, and I hope it never happens to me. But I also know that I will never know how they feel. I'll never be able to fully empathize with them because I've never gone through it. And I hope I never do go through it. And this transgender issue, I think, is similar in concept to that. I can speak to it, to my opinion on it, and from my own beliefs, but I've never had to directly deal with it. And therefore, I don't think it's fair for me personally to dictate how that should go, because I've never been confused in that way myself on who I am. I've never dealt with a child who was confused, or even a nephew or a niece. It's, I have friends who have, and I listen to them, but I've never experienced it, so it's really hard for me to say how those people should go. But I do know that if you're different today, you're bullied. I feel for these kids. I don't know what the answer is in that sense, but I agree with Mark in the sense that we still need to protect the teachers.
Right.
There are some teachers who have no problem saying, if you want to be called Jane, I'm going to call you Jane. Make a little change in my roll book. And there's other teachers that say, the name here says John, and I'm going to call you John. And if you and your parents want to come in and talk to me or to the principal, and then have the principal tell all teachers that John should be changed to Jane, then we'll do that. But until then, if your parents are going to call you John, I'm calling you John, and until I'm told otherwise. And it's just it's just their own beliefs.
It's another
Thank you for
place
that.
where you simply say, okay, John wants to be called Jane. and you, as a teacher, my reaction would be to call the parents and say, this is what's happening in school, how would you direct me?
That's a great
I think most
great
people would
insight.
prefer that than have
Yeah.
I think that's a preference, but that's also dangerous. I have had family members who have been abused because they want to go by different names and different genders. So that
Right,
is a
the
way.
parents could be
Yeah.
not in alignment with
Yeah,
that
yeah,
child.
and that is like a small group, but there should be some sort of process for that, just to make sure that the child is protected at home.
That's right, yeah.
Okay,
Not all
thank-
of us
thank
come
you for
from
that.
supportive families, right? Yeah.
You know, I think one thing that we're kind of dancing around and not talking about is social media.
Yes.
Because we do know that kids are impressionable. We do know that if they get bad information, it can create bad outcomes. We have seen what happens when children rely on algorithms from big data, and we've seen spikes in suicide.
Yes.
We've seen spikes in self-harm and cutting, and we've also seen spikes in dysphoria. And I can't help but wonder if some of this overload, this very fad or whatever you want to call it, is driven by some of the same dynamics that's seeing these other neuroses and these other bad behaviors play out. And so, each one of those is different, but each one of those can have really bad outcomes, and you always have to approach with compassion.
Yeah.
But are you really being compassionate if you're saying, it's okay, keep cutting yourself? Or it's okay to have, visualize suicide? Do we have programs in school that encourage those things? Or do we have mechanisms that, with all due compassion, try and check the harmful neurosis? Again, much of it I think is derived by algorithms and by social media and by popular culture and that kind of stuff. But again, they are kids, and compassion, they can be led down a primrose path. They are impressionable. And somebody has to be the adult in the room and say, wait a second. There are robust studies that say most cases of dysphoria work themselves out at age 15.
Exactly.
So, let's protect kids from making decisions that they'll most likely grow out of or that they can never reverse.
Absolutely.
So compassion is one thing. I don't like bullying either direction. I think some trans kids are very aggressive, and they will use it as a platform to bully other kids and other students and force them away into advantageous situations and go into locker rooms. And there's a whole, both sides of this.
Yep.
And so it's not, I think, it's tricky. I think a lot of it is driven by algorithms and the whole mess that society's undergone with COVID and isolation. And, those of us who have kids have seen the impact and the loss of the policies that derive from all that.
I think a lot of it is push-pull when it comes to that, because you're right, like people will get led down paths. I've never been so easily led down a path from somebody just saying, you can't do that and you can't feel that way, because it's wrong for you to feel that way. That makes me either go, okay, yes, or it'll make me go, bet. And so that's why
That's human nature.
Yeah, and that's why that open, I think that more open acceptance and saying like, I hear what you're saying, and I understand you feel that way. I don't understand. I understand the feeling, but I hear that you feel that way, and it's okay for you to feel that way. Here's more information.
It's not uncommon, and you'll probably get over it in a few years.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's a very compassionate thing to say.
Yeah, because you tell me I can't, I'm gonna do it.
Right. And I think that's kind of where you're coming from, Wayne. I see that you're, concerned about leading kids down a wrong path. And so you're saying, this is the information. And I think we have to get to a point, and I love what you said too, Paul, about really trying to understand what it's like to try and imagine what not only they're going through, but their parents. Imagine the parents going, wait a second, I wasn't prepared for this. Because I have 2 other kids and this was not an issue, and now I'm thrown into it, and I'm getting a lot of information from people judging what I'm doing, how I'm moving on both sides of the issue. And so that's why I just continue to wonder if we can't still hold on to truth, but wrap that truth in a good dose of compassion. And perhaps what you're saying, Mark, I'm going to go back to something that I continue to say. We need our school counselors to be school counselors. Somebody else can schedule the classes. In so many instances, that's what we see as my kids were in junior high and high school. I watched this, and we have issues unfolding even here in our beautiful community that these counselors are missing because they're behind a computer trying to juggle class schedules. Somebody else can take that on. Let's let them do what they were trained to do.
And you know, it's interesting, Madison County has tried a model where they've had this cooperative effort between the public school system and mental health care. So that children, how many are you familiar with this or not? Where a counselor or anybody in the school can refer a young person to Madison County for them to get the mental health counseling that they need. A very interesting model. I don't think it's unique to Madison County. I think I've heard of other places in the country, you know. I'm wondering why we in Idaho Falls couldn't take a look at that
I love that.
very issue. You know, fortunately, we have become a hub for medical. We have a lot of professionals, mental health, obviously the hospitals, and we've grown tremendously in that. So people don't have to go to Salt Lake anymore or Boise, you know. I think it would be interesting. But the problem is, I was in a round table that SIA had, that Becky Latham had with a group of community people, educators, other people, to try to look at this. But it's going to take somebody to champion it. Somebody's going to have to go and say, look, in our community, we need to look at a different model. Okay? Go look at Madison County. See how that works. Why couldn't we adopt that? But somebody's going to have to champion. It's usually top down. And I don't know who is interested in championing that, but because of the needs that we have, there are young people, and like you said, teachers, counselors, administrators, they're all overloaded, overworked, underpaid. They don't have the expertise or the time to address the mental health issues they're seeing in the classrooms, but how do they refer to it? You know, private people, you know, they get paid by insurance, private counselors, okay? Well, but if we had some kind of model, so I just gonna throw that on the table. I think it'd be a great model to look at for our community. I think it'd be compassionate. And let me go on the record and say is that I'm 100% against bullying. I remember a fist fight I got in the 7th grade. It stayed with me all my adult life because this kid was in the 9th grade was bullying a 7th grader, and I got cold cocked and knocked out. But I've always tried to be a peacemaker. You know, and I'm with you. My heart goes out to these things. Nobody should be bullied for anything. You know, if they want to dress like a girl or whatever, that's not right. Absolutely not right. You know, so I just want to go on the record for that.
So one thing that StuKent's doing that answers Mark's concerns about social media is we build simulations. And so in high schools throughout the world, but particularly even in Idaho, there's these simulations where kids in the classroom, rather than death by PowerPoint or paper worksheets, are actually in a digital simulation learning how things are operating. So we have one all on financial literacy, so they learn how to apply for loans and get paid and all that fun stuff. We also have a social media marketing one. So kids in high school get to see the backside of how do these algorithms affect them. And they're on the side behind the curtain saying, okay, I get to use different words and I get to put money behind things that show up, and how does that play out? And we think that's bringing awareness to the fact that we're all being played.
Oh,
if you don't think you're pulling up and scrolling, foreign countries are 100% trying to affect what we see, to shape our ideologies, as are companies and everything else. And it's just, I think, helpful for kids, particularly in this community, to see that it's not just random what they're seeing.
I think that's brilliant. When I was in high school, I took a class called mass media. We had to read Bernays' propaganda, and it was back when they were putting images in ads and all kinds of erotic stuff, and it was fascinating to understand how you were being played. Mm-hmm. And now with the digital overlay, that would be invaluable for students if we could build that into the curriculum.
Everybody should take that class.
Yeah,
Right.
that's a great idea.
That Nickelodeon documentary?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that Nickelodeon documentary of all the subliminal messages that I now remember. Like, I was like, watching that, I was like, I remember that. Oh. And it's not
Interesting, this roundtable that Becky Latham had at the Community Youth of Action. See, one gentleman was there, I don't remember his name, I didn't know him, I sat next to him, but he worked in the school district, I think he was a teacher, whatever. And he asked a question in this group of 30 people, okay? He said, what has changed between the time when we were in school, our age, and today, okay? And he whipped this out and said this.
Yep.
This has profoundly affected the behavior of students, not only in the classrooms and in the school, but outside of it, okay? This is one of the most addictive devices ever invented. The reason they spend billions and billions of dollars on apps and everything is because they know how addictive this is, okay? And of course you have the total, you know, the genie's out of the bag. I don't think you can ever prohibit these from the schools because parents want their kids to have it because they're concerned about a mass shooting, Columbine or whatever, you know, so, well, my kid needs to have this, you know. I'm not convinced they do, but that's a whole different topic, different conversation. But this thing has changed the game for our young people, and that's kind of what you alluded to. And
Yeah,
how we
right.
deal with that and help them deal with this, I really don't know. I mean, I can't tell you how many employers, being a part of the Chamber of Commerce, because I go around and call them businesses, and invariably we ask them, how can we help you as a chamber? And they say, well, I need better source of employees, and particularly the young people coming out. And it's usually not the conversation about they're lazy, but he says they can't focus. Okay, this has created a focus problem. They can focus very well on this, but put this down and have a conversation with a lot of young people, okay, they don't have that skill set. Well, some of them do, but a lot of them don't because this is their.
I can take it back even one more generation. When my daughter was preschool age, she was going to a Montessori preschool. And the Montessori teacher said, please limit TV. And I said, oh, but it's so much fun for her, you know, it's fun. She goes, teachers are not entertainers. And that child gets used to being entertained, and then they're not going to be able to focus when they get to school.
Yeah.
You know?
And those TV episodes back then were 30 minutes.
Yeah.
TikTok's now 30 seconds.
Isn't that gives us a real insight into the attention.
You can waste 3 hours in lots of 30-second increments.
Yes,
Oh, yeah.
you sure
At
can.
1 a.m.
But, you know, it's also a great educational tool.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, again, it gets down to, you know, the garbage in, garbage out, or the parents, are they setting parameters, are they engaged with their kids, and some parents check out.
Yeah.
You know, there's
Too many
way too many,
parents
there's,
do.
I mean,
Well,
we don't even want to
it's
even get to
interesting.
that.
I heard this. Somebody was at a dinner party, and Bill Gates and dad was there, and Warren Buffett were there. 3 of the richest men in the world. So Bill Gates' dad is fabulously wealthy. But anyway, so they asked him, what is the #1 key to success? And all 3 of them, at exactly the same moment, said, focus. Okay? The ability to focus is the key to success, whether you're a surgeon, an educator, or you design software or anything. So if a young person doesn't have the ability to focus outside of this, how successful are they going to be in life?
Right.
And the second key to success is having Bill Gates as your son.
Isn't that true? But you know, Brendan, that's what I love about what you guys are doing at Stuken. Giving kids that practical opportunity to try out some skills when they're in a safe setting.
Yeah.
Instead of making mistakes on the job, they're getting the opportunity to do that. I love all of the insight that's been shared, and I think we've come to a good conclusion in understanding that, you know what, we can agree to disagree, we can stand on truth, but it's always a good idea to try to wrap that truth in some compassion. And that's why we need more thought leaders to step forward and shine, and we need more mentors, because one thing I've observed, and I don't know if you guys have kind of seen this, but once upon a time, people were looking for real role models and mentors, and now our young people are looking to social media influencers and TikTok and all of that.
So I had a meeting with John Radford. And John is the city councilman and of course runs a not-for-profit here in town now. And he and I are working on a concept, speaking of libraries. Okay, we've had a discussion with the library director in the pre-COVID. We want to revisit that. We want to establish a mentor center as a room in the library where people can come and find a mentor for them. And we want to start with young people, but also senior adults. And so I just kind of want to break that into something that we think would enrich our community And the idea would be that, so we wanna focus originally, our initial focus is gonna be at-risk youth who have grade points below 3 point. And they're at risk in not graduating from high school. And the idea would be from 3 until 5 or 6, that room in the library and those computers and a supervisor, somebody who's there overseeing it, they could log on and find a mentor for their career goal. So if somebody wants to be an artist or beautician or a computer scientist or philosopher or zoologist, anything from A to Z, they could find somebody who's volunteered in the business community to mentor them for an hour or two once a week in the library, help them towards their career goal, and help them bring education alongside. You want to be a pilot? Well, that's important. You know, we're hoping we can get their grade point up and graduate. I've been working on this concept for years, and I'll just share one other thing. So I visited with the mayor of Memphis, Mayor Wharton. He's no longer in office, but I lived in Memphis, Tennessee for 20 years, and we talked about this concept. And he said, Wayne, he said, listen, let me tell you something. Here in Memphis, if you could move the needle, he said, by 10%, if this program worked, and you could get 10% more of the young people of Memphis to graduate from high school, which means they would go on to secondary education, and hopefully good careers and good families, he said, you would increase the tax base of this community by $1 billion over 10 years. Wow. Okay, you know, I'm not saying that would happen here, but you know, you mentioned mentoring. So, and then John has a concern for senior citizens, so he'd like to see it expanded so that in the afternoon from 12 to 3, or something like whatever the hours turn out to be, you know, senior citizens could go because they're isolated, and he's very concerned about depression among them because of COVID and their age and everything, where they could go log on and find a mentor for photography or, you know, whatever their interests are. So you said mentor, I just wanted to throw that plug in. So we're working on that concept, and we hope we can push it forward. We think if it proved to be effective, it could be expanded to, in the morning, single mothers who are trying to improve themselves. They have like a daycare, they pay a little bit, watch your child, but they get online and try to find a mentor, help them find a better job. In the evenings, it could be for high school students or whatever. You know, I mean, there's a lot of, you know, things like that. So we're trying to push that forward in our community. We think if we could prove the prototype here, it would work anywhere in the country in public libraries.
I love that. What a great use of our public libraries. I love all of the insight that's been shared. And Paul, as you were kind of talking about trying to really understand, you know, kids that are struggling, parents, it kind of made me think of something that Glenn Beck said last summer when he was in town, and that is that curiosity is the key. And I think that that's really true. As we lean in and we try to understand each other better, we can stand firm in what we believe, but still lean in and try to understand people a little bit better. And I think that'll go a long way in helping us to create more unity in our community. Time certainly flies. I want to go quickly around the room and just let each of you just finish with any final thoughts that you might have. Let me just say I've been totally inspired by each of you. Go ahead, Karen.
Wow. We talk a lot in my role as Director of Habitat for Humanity about establishing community. Our next project will be called Peterson Place Habitat's Community of Hope. And when we get together like this and talk over the issues, we find the commonalities rather than the differences. So, you know, I just think education requires everybody's efforts, parents, students, educators, and the general community to back it all up. So this has been great. Thanks.
Oh, thank you, Karen.
Yeah.
Oh.
God, I really don't have anything more to add. I appreciate the discussion. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 new acquaintances. Yeah, so Brennan, we've passed
We should be
somewhere.
friends at some point. We gotta go from acquaintance to friends.
Yeah, but anyway, enjoyed the discussion. Really good points that were made, and yeah, I just think on all of these issues, we all have things in common. We all have things that are not in common. But if we stick with the things that are in common, the world would be a better place.
Thanks, Paul.
Well, thank you for letting me be here today.
Of course.
It's amazing. You all are very strong individuals, successful in your own right, and it's fun when we can kind of throw it down, but at the end of the day, we go like, hey, we're still friends, you wanna go and have Coke?
We're best friends, man.
You know, it's my brother by another brother. Anyway, thanks for letting me come.
You bet.
So mentorship changed my life, and so mentorship is super important to me. I think all of these issues will be solved by mentorship, and so I encourage anybody in anything to use your business, place of position, to grab somebody and mentorship them and mentor them, even if they don't seem like they're worth it. Even when they frustrate you, and just grab them and really hold on and care enough to affect their lives, because it's changed my life, and that's what the heart is based off of. So.
Love that. I'm reminded of the old Congressman Sam Rayburn from Texas, who was speaker for a while, who I was fortunate enough to, when I worked in DC, was in his office. The Rayburn House office buildings where Congressman Simpson's office is. And his old quote was, any jackass can kick down a barn, but it takes a carpenter to build one. And in this community especially, we need more carpenters, and I appreciate what you're doing to bring carpenters together and to talk about what are we going to build rather than what are we going to tear down.
Thank you, Brandon.
Okay, well, I'm going to go off topic a little bit, and I'm going to bounce off something that you mentioned about local control. Just give you my perspective on this. And a lot of it has to do with how our country was formed. And the states were formed first. And so the individuals are the sovereign in our form of government. And they delegated initially their sovereignty to the state when the states were formed. And then eventually the states delegated part of that to the federal government, but they also delegated it to subdivisions. So the state is in a unique position because they're the ones through which the sovereignty flows from the people. So in theory, if the federal government needs to be brought to heel, it's the states that should do it. But also the state has a responsibility for all of its subdivisions, cities, counties, divisions. And so it's appropriate, if you understand the structure and the flow of sovereignty, that the state have some, even though it seems counterintuitive to local control, because they delegated the authority to the local entities, they have a responsibility to oversee them, just like in theory they should have a responsibility to oversee the federal government. So that's my little civic side.
Well, I love that, and thank you, KID crew, for being part of this table talk. And a great big thank you to our friends at Gandolfo's for this incredible lunch. It was good, wasn't it?
It was delicious.
Yes, and thank you to each of our thought leaders for being part of this table talk panel. And we'll do it again next month, second Thursday of the month. Thanks again.